Hello everyone, and welcome to Education USA Week. This week, university representatives, alumni, and our team from Education USA Japan have but a single goal: to help you achieve your dream of studying in the United States. Throughout the week, we will be holding seminars to explain many important study abroad topics, including college selection, writing essays, recommendation letters, scholarships, and study abroad for professionals. Our Education USA advisors are available and eager to help you discover all the options to study in the United States. This is a time of historic strength for the U.S.-Japan partnership, which is supported by the close personal bonds between the American and Japanese people. By studying abroad, you are making a tremendous contribution to fortifying the strength of our relationship and ensuring it endures for generations to come. I hope you will make the most of Education USA Week and wish you the best as you take the first steps in your USA Study Abroad adventure. Thank you.
Okay, as Ms. Glassman mentioned, Education USA Japan provides a series of webinars between August 17th and 21st called Education USA Week, America Ryugak Week. So I hope you and your students will make the best use of it. So here, I would like to quickly introduce the Education USA services. Education USA is a worldwide network supported by the State Department of the United States, which provides free advice and accurate and neutral information for international students who like to study in the US. In Japan, there are 6 advising centers, which is Sapporo, Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, Fukuoka, and Okinawa. And each center's service is slightly different, so please contact Education USA Advising Center in your region. By the way, Education USA Tokyo is run by the US Embassy and Fulbright Japan. And you will have a small gift at the end of the seminar today. So today's program is here. 2 speakers from US higher education institutions will kindly talk about the essence of what should be included in recommendation letters, do's and don'ts about writing good recommendation letters, and so on. So now I'd like to introduce 2 wonderful speakers joining us today from the US. Miss Kaitlin Healy from University of Vermont and Miss Anna Wise from Hamilton College, New York. So Kaitlin and Anna, would you like to start?
Yes, thank you so much, Chizuru. Thank you so much for giving us this opportunity. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen really quickly. Presentation view. And thank you so much for inviting us here. My name is Dr. Anna Wise. I am the Associate Dean of Admission and Director of International Recruitment at Hamilton College in upstate New York. And yeah.
Sure, and I'll go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Kaitlin Healy. I work as the Assistant Director of International Admissions at the University of Vermont, located in Burlington, Vermont.
So as Chizuru was able to introduce the session, our goal today is to give you some insight and some very valuable takeaways on the role and the construction of recommendation letters in the US college application review process. So I am a fairly organized person, so I like to lay things out so we know what to expect throughout the next hour and a half. So we're going to start with introductions, and then we're going to do an overview of our presenting institutions. This is just so you have an idea of some of our experience and where do we come from when we're coming to talk to you about recommendation writing. Then we are going to discuss the 2 different types of college application recommendations. Those would be counselor recommendations and teacher recommendations. We're going to go into some things do's and don'ts that recommendations should reflect. We're going to offer several examples. Hopefully, you were able to engage with some of our example materials before today's session, so you can be an active participant as we examine a few examples of recommendation letters. We're then going to look at some formats and take then a wider view and consider the overall context and roles of letters of recommendation within the application review process. Now, as promised, we're going to have plenty of time for questions towards the end. And I do know that we're going to be asking everyone to please use the Q&A function as they prepare their questions for later on today. But to get us started, we're going to introduce you to Hamilton College, which is the institution where I work. So Hamilton College is a selective liberal arts college located in the northeast portion of the United States. Our ranking for liberal arts colleges is 14. We are a need-blind institution for admissions policy review, and we promise to meet 100% of demonstrated financial need. Now, when we say a need-blind process for domestic students, this also would mean permanent residents or US citizens in Japan. But for all international students and every student admitted to our college, we have a financial aid policy that guarantees to meet 100% of their costs in order to allow a Hamilton education to be affordable to students from around the world. Our location, we're located in the center of New York State. Now, New York State is actually quite a large state. Believe it or not, we're in the center. It's about 4 hours to New York City from where we're located. So we're on a beautiful rural campus located on the edge of the Adirondack Mountain Range in the state of New York. We are quite a small college, so we have about 2,000 students, and we have a 9-to-1 student-faculty ratio. So we focus on very individualized instruction in a liberal arts environment. We have a reputation as a strong producer of writers and communicators, and also as an institution with strong focus on undergraduate research. In fact, we dedicate $500,000 each year to support and fund undergraduate research opportunities for our students. It goes to about 200 students who live on campus or travel abroad to do their research opportunities each year. For application plans, we have deadlines for November 15th is the earliest deadline for this year. That would be for early decision 1. And then we have an early decision 2 and regular decision deadlines on January 1st. I'm going to give you just a quick photo of our Hamilton campus so you can see, as I said, we're not located in New York City. It's quite a rural campus environment, but very, very beautiful on the edge of the Adirondack Mountains. I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Kaitlin.
Wonderful, thank you. And thanks everyone for being here today. So I'm here to talk to you a little bit about the University of Vermont, or UVM as we're also known. And I'm especially excited to be speaking with you about UVM because I attended there as an undergraduate student as well. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the University of Vermont, we are located in the northeast part of the United States. We're about 3.5 hours driving distance north of Boston and about 6.5 hours north of New York City, as well as being very closely located to Canada. So we're very centrally located and in a great spot for students to be able to travel to us both within the United States, but also from abroad as well. So the University of Vermont is a medium-sized public research university. We have about 10,000 undergraduate students on our campus who really come from all across the United States and all across the world. And when I speak about the University of Vermont, I really like to put academics front and center and speak about that first because of the amazing high-quality academic and research opportunities that are available to our students. We have something that's called a teacher-scholar model here at UVM, and what this means is that our professors are committed to teaching all of the classes themselves, but also they're committed to continuing to do research and staying relevant within their fields. So that way, our students aren't just being taught by professors, but really by individuals who are active practitioners and researchers. And our undergraduate students really get to be part of that research component, as our professors are constantly looking to the undergrad students to help them with their high-level research projects. These opportunities for research are the same no matter what students are studying, We have over 100 different majors for students to choose from, and that can be anything like business or engineering, maybe computer science. We also have a number of humanities degrees, but also field-based majors like environmental sciences, which is a particular specialty of the University of Vermont. And almost half of our majors have the option of completing an accelerated master's degree. So what this is students can earn their bachelor's and a master's degree in only 5 years, so they can save time and money. And again, one of the specialties of attending the University of Vermont is for students to get that really valuable hands-on experience and applying what they're learning in the classroom to the real world. And you can see some of the ways listed here that our students are able to do that. But getting that hands-on experience isn't just limited to what is available on our campus, but really it's available to students within the city of Burlington, which is where we're located. And living in the city of Burlington is really a highlight of a student's UVM experience. We're known as a top college town within the United States, and a big part of that is because of our location. We have this really amazing mix of both urban and rural. So we have a very vibrant downtown with a number of different shops and restaurants and a very lively music and art scene. But at the same time, we're surrounded by one of the largest lakes in the US and a number of mountains as well. So students can really feel close to and connected to nature while they're on campus. And Burlington is also highly ranked because we're known as a top 10 technology hub within the United States. That's because of all of the different companies and organizations that are based right here within the city of Burlington, and companies and organizations that we have close relationships with at the University of Vermont. So that means internship opportunities for our students while they're on campus, as well as job opportunities for those who wish to stay and live in the city of Burlington afterward. So just a brief introduction for you about the University of Vermont. You're always welcome to visit our website to learn more. But now we're going to dive into our presentation for you today, talking about letters of recommendation. And the first thing that we wanted to speak with you about is the difference between writing counselor letters of recommendation and teacher letters of recommendation. And I know that this can be a little confusing because I know that many of you who are listening today are acting both as a counselor and as a teacher for students. So when we speak about counselors, we're really speaking about those of you that have a role where you're assisting students in applying to universities, especially if you're helping students apply to US universities. So you're really helping them with that application process, you know, helping to pull together transcripts and writing those general recommendation letters. And then many of you will also act as teachers for students where you're actually teaching a student within a class. So there is a little bit of a difference in these letters of recommendation, and we're using the metaphor as a movie to try to explain this here. So when we talk about counselor letters of recommendation, when we speak about your role as counselors, counselors are really there to talk about the movie as a whole. And what that means is you're there in your letter to talk about how the student is performing as a whole. So we want to get a really broad overview of the student, both in terms of their academics, but then also as how they are as a student, or sorry, as a person. And so really within that letter of recommendation, you're helping to provide a lot of context and providing that additional information that we might not see in the rest of the application, and really helping to set the stage for the student. And then for those of you that aren't really approaching this with a counselor role, you're really just approaching this as a teacher that teaches a student in a class. What teacher letter of recommendations will look like is that you'll be providing information about an individual, we say plot line or performance. And what that means is that we're really looking for specific information about how the student performed in your class. So that means that you'll be telling us about the student's academic potential and about their classroom involvement. So you won't, as a teacher, you won't really be discussing too much about, you know, other classes that the student has been in or other activities, things like that, where you're really just going to be focusing on how the student performed within your classroom. So we'll go on to the next slide. So let's talk a little bit about why we even ask for letters of recommendation and why we find these helpful. Recommendation letters are really there to help us as admissions officers get to know the student on a more personal level. When we receive an application, there's a lot of data in there and there's a lot of numbers. And so we don't really get to know the student on a very personal level. We're seeing things like biographical information, we're looking at the transcripts and, you know, seeing all the grades that the student is getting. And there are a couple of other places within the application where we do get to see the student on a more personal level. For example, the student's personal essay, or if we provide interviews, we get to know the student a little bit that way as well. However, in those things, we're really seeing the student's perspective of themselves in those instances. But the letter of recommendation is really the area where we get to see an outside perspective of the student. And so that's where you come in to really show us how you think that the student has been performing. So you really allow us to see more personal qualities that we're not going to be able to see throughout the rest of the application. And recommendation letters are also very helpful because they let us see the progression, successes, and failures of a student. And I'll give you an example to kind of explain what we mean by this. So say that we are looking at, we received an application from a student, we're looking at the transcript and we see that the student received all Bs throughout years 10, 11, and 12. And looking at that, we can draw the conclusion that this is a B average student, so they're okay. However, what we don't see is that maybe the curriculum, it becomes much more challenging along the way. So the student's B in year 10 is not worth as much as that B in year 12. And you get to tell us about that. So you get to tell us that the curriculum was much more rigorous. It became much more challenging. Same with successes. If a student got a B in a class, but perhaps they really, really struggled in that class and they met with their teacher every day, they studied really hard and they ended up getting a B, and that was a really big win for the student. So you get to tell us that story. You get to tell us the details behind all of these grades that we don't see on the transcript that really help, again, tell that story and really provide that context to us that we wouldn't see through just the transcript. All right, and I think I'm going to pass over the next slide to Anna.
Thank you, Kaitlin. So we're going to talk then a little bit broadly for a moment about recommendation letters in general before we return to the concept of counselor recommendation letter versus teacher recommendation letter. So we want to talk about some examples of what a recommendation letter should be. So a quality recommendation letter, what should it reflect? So of course, the most notable thing that we are trying to consider is how would this student be as a student at our institution. So we're very interested and concerned with their academic ability. So we definitely want the recommendation letter to reference students' academic abilities and their potential for academic success. So as Kaitlin mentioned, not all students are successful all the time, but some students work very hard to improve over the course of their educational studies. And this can be something you can mark through your recommendation letter to show that the student has potentially, after year 10, they really got excited about their academic work and their quality of work improved, and you feel that this is something they're going to carry with them into their studies in university level. This could also tell us things that we can't necessarily see from grades. So maybe the student is an active and interesting engager in discussion in class, and the student brings points to consider to the classroom environment that most other people don't think of. The student might have interesting characteristics that are valuable in a classroom environment where we're trying to showcase students with valuable insights from lived experiences. And this can be the type of information you can include about a student's academic ability and potential in a classroom. However, at each of our institutions, we have a lot of students who apply each year who would be academically able to do the work. So more than just considering academics, universities in the US, we want to think about the student's personal qualities. You can think about the fact that a lot of our colleges focus on community atmosphere and our on-campus environments. I know my campus, for instance, 100% of our students live on campus for all 4 years unless they are studying abroad. So we are very concerned with if they come to our campus environment, what type of community member would they be? So we're looking for information on their personal qualities as well. So you can talk about some of these personal qualities that you find admirable in the applicant. Maybe the student has overcome quite a bit of challenges that we don't know about necessarily, but you know they've had challenges that they've overcome, and this shows the student is resilient and is able to come back when life is difficult. And those types of things can be really, really helpful for us. Or maybe you know that this student is very helpful to other people in their classroom environment and is a natural empathetic leader. These types of characteristics can be really valuable for us when we are considering an applicant to enroll at one of our institutions. Now, of course, we're interested in things like growth and maturity. If you've been a teacher for students, I'm sure if you've been a teacher in any subject, it is not news to say students will change and develop over 1 year, much less over their high school experience, right? So students will change and develop and grow and mature. And these are the types of things that are difficult for us to be able to tell when we are reviewing an application thousands of miles away. However, you have the student in your classroom environment, or you have the student in your high school, and you can speak to their growth and ways that they have matured over time, and this can be helpful. Now, with that said, it is also important to make sure that what you're saying is honest. Oftentimes, we can see some recommendation letters which are so glowing and amazing, and you think this student must definitely have already earned a Nobel Prize in something. And other times you might see some recommendation letter where counselor or teacher is quite critical. The important thing to realize is these students, when they apply to the United States, they're generally somewhere around 17, 18 years old. We know that they're 17, 18 years old, so there's still rooms for growth and progression, but we also want a fairly genuine experience from you, which says, these are my perceptions I have of the student as a 17-year-old. So we don't expect the student to be perfect, but we also want to make sure we're being fair if a student is growing and progressing through their experiences. Now, let's talk about some things what they shouldn't be. So these are things that we will sometimes see in recommendation letters that are submitted. The first is sometimes counselors or teachers feel like they want to just say everything that the student is involved with. The student has started a club and they did this project and they did this, and it really becomes a resume for the student. Now, as part of the application, the student has all of the opportunity to submit, these are my involvements, these are things that are important to me. So the recommendation letter should not be just a list of activities or class projects the student has engaged in. We can find that information elsewhere in the application. We're really looking for more of the elements that we can't find in other portions of the application submitted. We also sometimes will see letters where the teacher explains the elements of the curriculum, or they explain their own history of their professional background. So I attended this university and I worked for 15 years at that organization, and now I teach this course and we cover this subject, this subject, this subject. Remember that the recommendation is meant to be telling us about this specific student within the academic or the classroom or the high school environment. So it should be focused on the student as opposed to the credentials of the teacher, or as opposed to the overall syllabus of the curriculum that the student is pursuing. Additionally, sometimes counselors or teachers will think the longer the essay, the better, or the longer the letter of recommendation, the better. In reality, there's definitely an issue if recommendation letters tend to be over a page or really over 2 or 3 pages, because usually you can say enough information about the student within a concise manner. And really for application submissions, admission officers very much appreciate when the important information can be delivered in a concise, easily readable fashion. So I encourage you to consider keeping to 1 page if possible. Now, other things that sometimes people will do is they will have their own traditional flair. So the style that they want to follow when they submit a recommendation letter, which can sometimes be writing in big fonts or purple ink, or changing different margins, or not necessarily signing with their traditional school title. Try and make sure that this is a formal document. So this means that while we encourage creative expression in a lot of areas of life, this should be a formal and professional document. We would ask you to deliver it that way. And finally, there's a copy-paste format. Sometimes we will get applications for 10 students from the same high school, and almost everything in the recommendation letter is the same, with just maybe changes in the student name. We discourage this because, of course, it's not personalized about the student. Hopefully all of your students are high achieving and empathetic and charismatic and all of these great things, but they should be slightly different, as every single one of us as human beings has differences. So please try not to do the copy and paste format. I'm going to pass off to my colleague Kaitlin once again.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more in detail about what counselor recommendations should look like. As we've mentioned before, the counselor recommendation should really be there to provide context and really help tell a story behind what we're seeing in the transcripts and what we're seeing in the rest of the application. And so ways to do that is by including some very important information. Sometimes it can be very helpful for us as admissions officers to just get a little bit of general academic information about the school. And so that means, knowing a little bit about the type of curriculum. Maybe your school is one of the most competitive within your prefecture or within your city. So that information is really helpful for us to know. I would say that many times when you are submitting the students' transcripts, you're also submitting a school profile if your school has one. So just try not to repeat too much information that's on that school profile. In terms of providing some general academic information, you can probably just type it out in a sentence or two and let us know. But if you're not providing a school profile, if your school does not have one, this can be a great place to just give us a little bit more information about the type of school and the type of curriculum that the student is attending. It's also really helpful to know how long you have known the student. Some counselors and teachers have known students for their entire lives. Some, it might just be for the duration of secondary school. But for some of you, you may be brand new counselors or teachers that really have only known the student since the beginning of the academic year. And that's certainly all right. You can definitely let us know about that, and then just let us know how you've been getting, or the type of information you're getting from other sources about the student. And then of course you want to provide an academic overview of the student. So we're really, again, looking at the progression of the student, trying to get to know that a little bit better, really trying to get an understanding of all of the courses that the student has taken and how they've really performed overall. As well as personal characteristics. As Anna had mentioned, we're really trying to build communities here on our campuses. We're not just looking for good students who are going to be filling our classroom spaces. We're really looking for students that are going to be a good fit for the type of community that we have here. And then of course, as we mentioned, the extenuating circumstances. So any information you have about if the student maybe has some sort of illness or some household issue that may have really impacted their grades, that's helpful information to know. But again, just making sure that you get the student's permission to share that information with us. And then just making sure that you try not to repeat too much information within your recommendation that's not already within the rest of the application. There's, you can repeat information if you have to provide a little bit more information about that. So for example, maybe you have to explain a bad grade or something like that. But our ask is to just try to be careful and mindful and not repeating too much information that we already see elsewhere. So if we go on to the next slide now, we'll see an example letter of recommendation that a counselor from a school wrote. Hopefully you've all had a chance to review these example letters of recommendation beforehand. But what I'd like to do is just give you another minute or so to read through this recommendation letter one more time, look through it, and then if you would like, you can open up the chat box and you can type into that and let us know your thoughts about this recommendation letter. Let us know what things that you like about it, or where you think there are some strong points, or if you think there are any weak points, you can absolutely share that information as well. So I'll give you all about a minute or so to review this, and then we'll come back together and talk about it as a whole group, and really talk about, what are the points that we really like within this letter of recommendation. So I'll just mute myself for another minute or so and let you review that. Okay, I think that was about 1 minute. So we'll come back together. I don't see any comments popping up, but if you can think of anything that you think is really strong with this application, feel free, or with this recommendation letter, feel free to share that. I can start off by just pointing out some of the things that I really like about this. And I'm really thinking about two big things when I'm looking at this recommendation letter. There's the content, of course, so all of the information that goes into the recommendation letter, but then there's also the format. And I can tell just by looking at this, I haven't even read any words yet, but just by looking at this recommendation letter, I really like how it's laid out, how it has very clear paragraphs, how it has bolded headers so that we can easily see the type of information that the counselor wants to share with us. Right away, we see that the counselor is letting us know how long they have known the student. And what I really like that this counselor did was they provided just a few words in the beginning of the recommendation letter to tell us about the student. So right away, with only using 4 words, I get an idea of the personal characteristics of the student. I know that the student's kind, empathetic, curious, and driven, which sounds a lot like our University of Vermont students. So right away, I can tell that this student is going to be a good fit within our campus community. And then I see here that they provided an academic overview, which was really helpful information to just get a little bit of an understanding of where the student is coming from academically. Now, you will see within the academic overview, the counselor did repeat information that can be found on the transcripts. The counselor listed some of the classes that the student has been taking: honors neurobiology, honors biotechnology, and honors Latin. And I actually like that the counselor repeated this information because they shared why the student is taking those classes. They say because these classes align with the student's interest in pursuing a career in the medical field. So this is an example of how you can pull information that's already going to be within the application and then just provide a little bit more information to it. Then we see that the counselor provided some notes about personality, character, and citizenship. And I see that someone made a comment here. Yeah, a bit nebulous about empathy. The specific courses and academic achievements were good. Yeah, I agree there. We saw some really good specific information about the courses, about how they're doing academically. And sometimes when it comes to personality, it can get a little bit vague. But yeah, I absolutely agree with you there. It's still good to try to get a sense of the personality of the student. So in as much detail as you can provide about the student, that just helps us so much, again, as we're building our communities on campus. Then I can see that there weren't any extenuating circumstances that we have to consider for this student. And then in the end, the counselor just wrapped it up with just a general overview and recommendation for the student. So yeah, so I just wanted to share that one with you. Thank you so much for your thoughts on that one. Let's go on to the next example. This one's a little bit shorter, so I'm just going to mute myself for maybe about 20 seconds this time. I think you should be able to read through it pretty quickly, and then we'll talk about that one. All right, and once again, if you have any thoughts about this, please feel free to add that into the chat. So this was a much shorter recommendation letter, and you know, a short recommendation letter is always fine. Oftentimes we say that less is more when it comes to recommendation letters. So definitely, by all means, if that works better for you to provide something that's short, please go ahead and do that. For this one, I do notice that a lot of the sentences that the counselor wrote about the student were a little vague, and I didn't really get as much detail as I was hoping to. You'll notice in this first sentence here, when they're talking about John Clark, they said that he had a satisfactory educational pathway while he was enrolled in the school. And we don't really know what that means. I'm not sure what satisfactory educational pathway means at that school and what it means to the counselor. Maybe it means that they just met all of the requirements to graduate. You know, maybe it just means they passed all of their classes. I'm not really sure. Yeah, Hatsumi just made a note here, no episode or specific context. Exactly, yeah, there's not really anything too specific within this letter of recommendation. In the second paragraph, you see the sentence that says, I understand John is applying to the Science and Environmental Studies program at your university. That's true. I already know that because that is listed on the application. So it's a little bit of repeat information that's not very helpful in this instance. And then you can also see that the counselor says that he's very, very confident he has all the necessary skills to succeed, but we don't know what those necessary skills are. Again, it's very vague. Yeah, we had another comment here from Mariko who says no supportive or impressive information. I definitely agree with you there. There's really not a whole lot of details that is provided in this example. And I show you this example just to kind of encourage you to think of really telling stories about your students and providing examples that can really help to be supportive of your students. And this isn't meant to show you to, scare you away from writing a shorter letter of recommendation. By all means, shorter can definitely, provide all the information that you want to share. But I think just trying to stay away from something that's a little vague and try to add some more details would make a really strong letter of recommendation. So let's talk about the teacher ones now. I'm going to pass this back over to Anna to talk about teacher recommendations.
Thank you. So moving to the teacher recommendation side, and remember again, when we talk about counselors and teachers, that these have different roles in our application process. So usually when students will apply to a college, they will need to have at least one counselor recommendation and maybe one or two teacher recommendations. So in certain schools, excuse me, but my thing is very sensitive. I apologize for that. It wants to change so quickly. In certain schools, we understand that counselor recommendations will be submitted by teachers in specific context. But it's important to realize, again, as Kaitlin was saying, in the application review process, the counselor recommendation gives more of a macro or a high level consideration of the student and also focuses on personal qualities. Whereas the teacher recommendation is rather more narrow in its scope, and it really focuses on this student in your specific classroom environment. So you want to think about information to include, of course, which subject was the student involved in, what did you teach, and how long did you know the student? So similar to as Kaitlin mentioned, we know that there are some teachers who will work with the same student for several years, and there are other teachers who will work with a student only for one term. So this will limit some of the information that you're able to share about the student depending on how long you've known them. So we also want to consider the student's personal qualities and strengths within a class. Maybe this class is very writing intensive and you know that the student has worked very, very hard to improve in their writing skills throughout the process, and you want to share that information. Maybe the class is very collaborative and has opportunities for students to share their opinions and insights. And you know that this student tends to be a little more shy, but that they have very strong insights and interests when they are engaged properly in a classroom. These types of things can be very helpful and can also bring us again to the idea of personal characteristics. So we know that not every student learns in the same fashion. Some students will respond to different types of instruction. Some students do very well in group settings, and some students do better in smaller, more individual environments. So these are the types of characteristics that can be helpful for us through a teacher recommendation. Now, things like extenuating circumstances, we've been talking about this throughout, and we are going to slow down a little bit towards the end of the presentation and talk about what would appropriate extenuating circumstances that you would want to write about be. Some of these could be, for instance, if you have a student with a learning difference. Maybe your student has ADHD, or maybe your student is dyslexic, different types of learning differences in a classroom. These can be things that can be helpful if you have observed them within your classroom environment. However, it is also important in a teacher recommendation that this really should be focused on the student's experience in your classroom. So things like extracurricular involvement or community engagement, those types of things would probably be more effective in a counselor recommendation. The teacher recommendation is meant to focus on their academic performance in your classroom environment. So focus on what have you actually observed with the student in your classroom environment. So we're going to do a similar exercise as we just conducted, which is I'm going to put myself on mute for just about a minute, and we're going to look at these two examples. Now, these are two slightly different examples, excerpts from different recommendation letters. We think that there are some strengths to each of them, and we'd love to hear your comments through the chat feature. See, it changes so quickly. Okay, I'm going to go on mute for just a minute. Thank you. Okay, so we did receive also a comment in the question and answer section, which was about the previous example with Mary Smith and commenting on the redundancy with previous sections. So I think it's important to note, while we can find this information elsewhere in the application, this does not mean you cannot reference something we cannot find in other places. Really, what we want to encourage you to do is to focus on, whenever possible, adding value to the application. So rather than thinking about, oh no, this thing has been said before, that means I should make sure I definitely don't address it at all. Think about it instead, our goal is to get to know the student's personal qualities and academic qualities, which means that we want to focus on value added. So when we say we don't want to repeat things from previous sections, that can be if a recommendation really only reflects information we can find elsewhere. You're not really adding additional value, context, color, and consideration to the recommendation letter. So I do want to be certain that we are sharing the fact that everyone's recommendation letters are slightly different, and there is no perfect requested format for everyone to follow. So what we want to do through this presentation is just to give you some examples of options that are out there, some do's and don'ts, things to consider, and realize that recommendation letters are really more of an art than a science, if we use that story. So there's no perfect format to follow. Everyone's will be slightly different, but you really want to focus on adding value to the student's application and adding important information that we cannot find elsewhere. So this is not to say definitely don't repeat anything that's elsewhere in the application. It's more that if you use half of a page to do so, then you're not using that half of a page to advocate further for the students. So I hope that clarifies a little bit of that. But so let's then focus a little bit on these do opportunities and examples. I am still hoping to get some comments through the chat feature, but I will talk about a few things that I enjoy through these recommendation letters. The first is that this gives me quite a personal understanding of each student. So let's focus on Susie to begin with. So Susie, this teacher has known Susie since she was a freshman, and she's seen her in different areas, which she thought was relevant because she was at first surprised by how Susie was in her classroom environment. But she was able to see that Susie was really a person who needed to consider her thoughts and consider the topic at hand before she was able to speak her opinions. So she was really a thoughtful person who needed to consider all of the facts before contributing to a conversation. She also made a note that there's a lot of us in society today who tend to speak before we have all of the information. So this is really a strength that the student has, in that she is reflective and she is considerate, and sometimes that at first can come off as shy and reserved. This can be helpful information if we see elsewhere in her application. Maybe she did an interview with us and she seemed rather quiet and shy, and this can really give us more understanding about how her specific thought process works and how she might be in a classroom environment. She also focuses on some aspects that can be difficult for students to learn, such as empathy. So when we're looking at a topic such as ethical statistics, the importance to be able to understand empathy and the point of view of others is very valuable, and is a hard thing to be able to teach a student. So that type of skill can be very helpful for us to know about. So then the second recommendation letter, focusing on Lily. Lily, we can tell from this recommendation letter that she is very involved in the topic. She is very vocal. She is also very interested in applying some of the subjects that she's learning to her outside interests and involvement outside of the classroom environment. They also are very helpful because this compares Lily to students within her class and also students in the high school level. From this teacher's perspective, Lily has academic achievement potential, which is far higher and far exceeds the high school level. These types of information can be really important because we know grading scales and academic results from around the world can be very different based on specific secondary schools, based on different countries. Some countries will have more stringent grading than other countries. But when teachers are able to give us context and say, this is how the student performed within her classroom environment, and she has far outpaced and has far been and has exceeded the expectations I would have for a student. That also tells us that Lily is likely that's a special type of student that we would be very interested in having on our campus environment. Now, with that said, we are going to focus on a couple of don't examples. So I'm going to mute myself just for a few seconds, probably 30 seconds or so, and allow you to review some of these excerpts from recommendation letters, and we'll talk about what some of the don'ts are reflected here. So a lot of these are pretty straightforward, right? They're straight out of our don't category list before. So the first example is the counselor or the teacher introducing himself. He's saying, this is who I was, this is where I graduated, this is where I taught, I have all this experience. He's already said all of this content without saying anything about the student until that very last word, where he says, I know what a worthwhile member of the community is. Of course, we don't know what that means. What type of metric is this person using for a worthwhile member of the community? And that this portion of the recommendation letter is not about the student, it's more about the teacher. So again, we want to make sure we're focusing on writing about the student, not the teacher. So the second one is an example of a recommendation letter that might focus on the syllabus a little too heavily. You can see all of these different authors that students are working with. Every student is going to write a term paper. This type of information is more about your teaching learning environment. We want to know how is the student successful within your teaching learning environment. The next one is an example of kind of a resume type recommendation letter. All of this information about clubs and organizations, these can be found elsewhere in the application. And again, we want to make sure that we are adding value to the application as opposed to repeating things that can be found elsewhere in the application. Now, finally, we have our section, which is Mary is very motivated and capable student. I know she will be a great addition to Yale University. The problem with this recommendation letter is neither Kaitlin nor I works for Yale University. So you will be surprised how frequently we will read recommendation letters that are glowing and wonderful about the student, but will then reference the wrong college and university. We know that most students, when they're applying, are applying to more than one college or university. But if we see the wrong university listed in your recommendation letter or in their college application essay, this can indicate that the student may not truly be interested in attending Hamilton College or University of Vermont. So we encourage you to keep your application letters without the name of an institution, because these types of errors are very easy to make. Okay, so we have a comment from Mariko saying, needs to focus on academic elements of the applicant. Yes, absolutely. So none of this really tells us anything about the student's ability to be successful in an academic environment, does it? All of these examples really tell us other types of information, and other than, I suppose, the last one where we now know the student is motivated and capable. But I think we all agree that those are quite general terms. And if we compare them to the pictures that were created or the stories that were told about the previous applicants, you can understand that this type of information would not necessarily be helpful. Another thing that you should, of course, make sure that you are checking. Sometimes students will have teacher recommendation letters that are submitted that actually have the wrong name attached or even the wrong gender, things like that. These are very simple errors that can be made, but they can be examples of teachers who are writing recommendation letters hastily and quite quickly. So as with anything that you would submit, this is a professional document. We want to make sure we're taking time to get all of that correct. Otherwise, you might confuse the admission officer. I'm going to pass off now to my colleague, Kaitlin, who's going to talk about some formats.
Great, thank you. So very quickly, I just want to talk about sort of how you can format your letter of recommendation. And there's many ways to do this, but one of the most common formats that we see is the narrative one. So this would be a narrative letter that it just looks like a traditional letter of recommendation. So as if you were writing, an essay in English, it looks like a 5-paragraph letter. So that's what a narrative one looks like. Then there are some counselors and teachers that will use a bulleted format. So that means that recommenders are going to be using a lot of bullets to draw out information that they really want to highlight within the letter of recommendation. This is really helpful for us too, as admissions counselors who are going through these recommendation letters quickly, because it helps to have information pop out at the page and that we can easily see. But many recommendation letters are going to be a mixture of these two formats. So oftentimes we see a mix of narrative where we see a few paragraphs, and then we'll see some bullet points having some information pop out for us. When it comes to formats, there's many ways that you can do it. But of course, we would still like to encourage folks to try to limit your recommendation letter to just one page. We read many applications and many letters of recommendation, and oftentimes you can get all of the information that you would like to convey about a student, both in terms of their academics and then also their personal characteristics. Usually you're able to fit all of that into one page. But if we go on to the next slide, I'll show you just a quick example. We don't have to spend too much time looking at the content of this recommendation letter, but I just wanted to kind of give it as an example to see how this is laid out and what's helpful about it. We can see that this is a mixture of both narrative, but then the recommender also used bullet points throughout to try to draw out some important information. So we see a mix of these paragraphs. What I really like about this format is the headers that they use in each of them. And we also saw that in the example counselor recommendation that I had shared earlier, where there are these bolded headers. So I know exactly what is going to be shared within each paragraph and within each section of the recommendation letter, which is very helpful as we're going through many of these letters. So I know right away that in this first paragraph, the recommender is talking about the qualities of the students. And then I know that they transition on to talking about the academic highlights and finishing with talking about the activities and interest areas. So I just find this very, very helpful, because I know before I even get too much into reading the paragraphs here, I already know the types of things that the recommender is going to be covering about the student. All right, just saw a comment here, great. But that's what I just wanted to share with you about the format of our recommendation letters. And I'll pass it off to Anna, who'll finish up our presentation for us.
And so I want to make a comment also on this section, because if you look at academic highlights, you'll find some interesting information there that you may originally have paused to think, why does the counselor or the teacher want to share this information? The first is, of course, that Eric was diagnosed with a learning difference, which impacts his math and language learning. This is a key example of an opportunity where you can give us information that is very important and notable about this student that has affected his grades, because you can see that he received the assistance that he needed in order to be brought to an equal level with his classmates. But the grades that he received before he received that diagnosis still existed on his transcripts. So this suggests that maybe in his 9th grade, he had quite some low grades in math and language, which was not necessarily due to the fault of the student. It was due to an undiagnosed learning difference. This provides very helpful context for us in considering the application, where we might normally see those lower grades and think, what is that? What happened there? Here, the counselor or teacher is giving us a great example of why did that happen. And that brings us to the idea of context. So one of the benefits, again, of applying to universities in the United States is that we are not necessarily just looking at academics. We're not just looking at testing. We really are trying to get to know the student as a person and to imagine how would they be potentially as a successful student and member of our community here at Hamilton or here at University of Vermont. So with that said, we consider the word context quite heavily. Each year we have more students who apply to our institutions who would be academically successful than we have the space and capacity to have on our campus. So we really want to get to know them as a human being, to imagine them in our environment on campus. With that said, sometimes each person who goes through life has different challenges and opportunities that are available to them. And we consider this context. In admissions review, we're always trying to think, what types of opportunities did this student have? How did they challenge themselves? But we also want to know what types of challenges were facing them that were maybe outside of their control. So a recommendation letter is a great place to provide this type of context that we might not normally know. Kaitlin used the example earlier of a student who gets all B's throughout the study process, but maybe that student actually worked very, very hard to get those B's, or maybe that student has additional considerations and challenges they have to overcome, which would make their B a more impressive accomplishment than another student who might earn that same grade. So some examples of I've divided it into pre-COVID and post-COVID just for your help. The pre-COVID examples of things that would be very appropriate to be referenced through a recommendation letter would be, I know that this student travels hours, maybe 2 hours by train each day to come to school. So that means that the student is working very hard, getting up very early and doing very heavy work in order to get to school environment. This is not something we can necessarily see from the transcript, but tells us a lot about the student's character and also tells us about what is important to the student, what their values are. Other things might be family responsibilities. We know some students can go home and spend hours and hours studying in a quiet environment with full Wi-Fi in a private room, and other students don't have that environment to go home and study to. Maybe they have responsibilities watching their younger siblings, maybe they're taking care of older relatives. These types of things can impact their academic performance, but also shows who they are and what types of opportunities they've had for responsibility, which is very important for us in a consideration of their personal qualities. Other types of things might be illnesses or learning differences. We talked about that just a moment ago, how this student from the previous example may have some lower grades, which can actually be just explained through undiagnosed learning differences. Or maybe a student had an illness which really impacted their examination date if they have a specific examination that's important. And if they were ill during that time frame, that can reflect itself as lower grades for that examination, and can be something that's very helpful for you to address through your recommendation letter. Now, with COVID context, of course, COVID-19 has impacted every student applying to study in every country around the world. We know this, and we are also trying as much as we can to make sure that we are making accommodations for students and we are not penalizing them for things that are outside of their control. So if you have additional insight about how COVID-19 has impacted the student, this is the type of information that can be valuable for you to share with us. Maybe someone in their family got sick and they had certain responsibilities, or maybe they got sick and this impacted some of their time in a classroom environment. Maybe their involvements in extracurricular activities were canceled because it was deemed out of safety considerations. A lot of extracurricular activities were canceled. Maybe, on the other hand, this student was home from school and really wanted to find ways to help with their community. So they ran a local food drive, or they raised money for medical supplies. Those types of things can be positive contexts that can add value to the overall application. So it's important to know context can be helpful when we consider the adversity that a student may have encountered in pursuing their education. And this really tells us again a lot about a student's characteristics and personal qualities. As much as we all want to say an education in the US would be an easy achievement, I think we all know that it will be challenging even in the best of circumstances. So understanding that a student has previously had opportunities to overcome and conquer challenges and adversity in their past can really be a great indication of that student's potential success in the future. It can also help institutions ensure that they have resources to support students on campus. So when counselors or teachers talk to us about resources that might be helpful in assisting a student, we can then prepare to make sure we're able to support them when we come on campus. So if you know that a student has had an issue, potentially a medical issue or a learning difference, or a student has a fear about a specific aspect of applying to the US, if we know about that in advance, we can make sure when we admit them that we have the resources in place to support that student and ensure they have all the opportunities for success. Now, it is important to note, context can be very helpful. And again, I hope that I'm being clear that there are both contexts that are positive aspects and also contexts that talk about adversity that a student has overcome. So some of this can be initiative and some of this could be adversity the student has overcome. This type of information can be very valuable to admission officers. However, before you share this type of personal information, particularly about learning differences or medical challenges, it is very, very crucial that you communicate openly with your student and protect their confidentiality. So oftentimes it can be valuable to talk with a student and say, what type of information do we want to ensure colleges know about opportunities you've had, adversity that you've overcome, and how is that best reflected throughout the application? But it's very important that you have this conversation with students because it is their personal, private information. You don't want to divulge something without their consent. Now, I do want to talk then just for a little bit about the role of recommendation letters within the overall holistic application review. So when we use the word holistic in the United States, we're using that to reflect the term that we've been saying this whole time, which is we're not just looking at academics, we're also interested in a person's personal qualities. So that means there are many aspects to an application that we consider. So when we think about academic success, we're looking at transcripts, we're looking at grades, sometimes we're looking at testing, although I believe both of our institutions are test optional this year. But we also want to know personal qualities for them. So we're going to look at your recommendation letters. We're also going to look at their essays, extracurricular involvements that they may have, and sometimes interviews and other types of ways that they have engaged with us. So the recommendation letter should complement the content throughout the application and add value and additional details. So that means that we want to add more insight for elements that are reflected elsewhere in the application. And we want to make sure also that it is coherent. So if the student talks about the fact that, oh, you know, I'm so proud of the fact that I'm engaged in all of these activities and political discourse, and I'm very loud and I'm very excited, and the recommendation letter says, oh, this student is very shy and meek and never, that's to us is surprising, right? That tells us it seems like it does not flow. It does not reflect the student you've seen elsewhere. So instead, we want to think about your recommendation letter as supporting content elsewhere, and also adding additional value and context that can be helpful for us in consideration of the whole student. I wanted to finish this section with the metaphor, which we have in the US, which says, you miss the forest because you focus on the trees. So oftentimes we think about a student, we think about an application, we think about life, and we focus on one specific aspect as opposed to the whole. So in this example, this might be focusing on only a student's participation in one specific exam, or only focusing on academics as opposed to personal qualities, only focusing on one aspect of the application. Instead, we want to try and think holistically. We want to think about the forest, so the overall image that the application is promoting of the student. This should be an accurate reflection of the student, again, with the understanding this is probably a 17-year-old student who still has some growing and developing to do, but we want to reflect them fairly, accurately, and with an eye towards their potential. If they come to the United States, how will they be academically? How will they be socially, culturally? How will they be as members of our community? And think about the overall student, the overall application, and how does your recommendation supplement, complement, and support the overall application a student has submitted. With that, I think we are going to transition into question and answers. So I do see a comment from Makiko, which says, new expression from the presentation, learning differences. Thank you. Yes, learning differences. So we all have differences in life, absolutely. But we would love if you would have any questions, if you'd be able to submit the question in the question and answer box. We are very happy to answer those questions. And thank you so much for taking time and waking up early this morning to talk to us. We appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much, Kaitlin and Anna, for your great presentation and comprehensive, expression. I was also very impressed with the interaction with the chat box. It's really impressed. Great. So can I just can you stop sharing your presentation so that okay. Thank you. So now we like to open up questions from the participants as long as we have time. I think we have 20 minutes. So anyone who has any questions, please write down your questions in English into the Q&A section. So are there any questions? Please don't be shy.
Maybe I can start us off if we're waiting for folks to write in their questions. I know that one of the frequently asked questions that I think you all have gotten and that we definitely get is what to do if a teacher or a counselor does not speak English or does not feel comfortable writing a letter of recommendation in English. And so oftentimes what we see is that a counselor or a teacher can write a letter of recommendation in their native language. So absolutely you could write it in Japanese, and then we just ask that that letter of recommendation get translated. At the University of Vermont, we would accept a translation that comes from a colleague at the school, but we would be limited to someone at the school. If there's no one at the school who would be available to provide that translation, then we would ask for an official translation through a translation company. So that is one way to provide a letter of recommendation if you do not feel comfortable writing one in English.
Thank you, Kaitlin. Okay, now we have one question. Do you see any particular what shouldn't be done in recommendation letters from secondary school in Japan? So any of you, can you answer?
I don't think I can speak to specific examples from Japan that are more so than other examples from other locations. I think the same type of things that we've talked about throughout publishing resumes of students or focusing on either being too harsh or too soft on students, so without using actual descriptors that are personal. These are things that we see, I would say, from Japanese secondary schools as well as other secondary schools. But I wouldn't say that there is a specific issue that we experience from Japan. Kaitlin, would you agree? Yeah.
I would agree with that. I can't think of anything that is specific to secondary schools within Japan. I think just keeping in mind the general advice that we had here, and then just again providing that value add. So if you can provide any additional information about the curriculum of your secondary school, let us know how competitive it is. That can also be very beneficial for not only us, but also for your student who is applying.
Thank you. We have one more question. Do you often contact recommenders?
Go ahead, Anna.
So we would contact recommenders with specific circumstances. So we read through a lot of applications, and we read from most of us in international education. We review students in local, national curricula. We review them in international curricula. And sometimes something looks different to us that we have a question about. So we will usually reach out to recommenders if we have additional follow-up questions. Maybe you said something in your recommendation which does not seem to correlate with the other content we've seen in the application. Remember, we used the example again of a student who presents themselves as, oh, I'm loud, I'm involved, I'm doing all of this thing, and then your recommendation letter, you say they're very reserved, they never, they turn in their work late or anything like that. Or maybe it might be a situation where you add context about school's grading system. As Kaitlin mentioned, we are very interested usually in how is the student performing in comparison to their peers and colleagues. So if we need more information about that aspect, we might definitely follow up on that aspect. I would say that usually we will ask questions when these questions arise to us, and that generally comes from some type of confusing element that we'll come across in an application. So usually it won't be something like, you said the student is charismatic in class, please explain. It's going to be more based on a specific item of information. Now, with that said, if you submit an application through a common application, Common App or Coalition application, there is an option for you to select, I would like a phone call with the admission office. If you select that option, saying, I would like a phone call with the admission office, we will call you. We will make sure that we are in contact with you before we make a decision. At least at my institution, we will not make a decision on a student application until you and I have been able to connect, either through phone, maybe through Skype, maybe through different opportunities. But I want to know, why did you select that I want to call? Because sometimes teachers or counselors will have information they want to share they don't think is best presented through a recommendation format. Maybe it's something where discussion is better and more helpful. Sometimes, of course, people will check that box in error. So oftentimes when we reach out to students and to counselors and say, why did you check this box? They will say, oh, I didn't realize I did it. It's not an error, not an error. It is an error. Please, the student is great. Don't worry about it. So we won't usually reach out unless we have a specific reason. But if you indicate to us, I want to be contacted by your office, we will contact you.
Okay, thank you. Another
University of Vermont. Oh.
Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I apologize. I was just going to say it's the same response for the University of Vermont. We're really only going to be reaching out if there's some information that you provide that makes us think that we should be reaching out to you, especially if it has to do with any disciplinary issues. But for us, often what we'll do is we will attempt to connect with the counselor first. So even if there's some information in the teacher recommendation, oftentimes we'll go to the counselor first to just double check with them and make sure that it's okay to reach out to you. I know that many of you also kind of straddle both roles. So if you call yourself a counselor within the common application, for example, then we'll reach out to you first.
Thank you very much. Okay, okay. Which do you prefer to read recommendation letters? 1, typed in letter pad with school letterhead. 2, letters typed in a box in a common application page.
Yeah, I can answer that first. I definitely prefer questions that are typed on a separate sheet with the official letterhead. It makes the recommendation letter appear much more formal. And it's also just easier to read. Just speaking as someone who reads hundreds and hundreds of applications a year, it's really easy to read through its entirety when it's on its own separate page. So definitely on its own page with the school letterhead.
Thank you. Okay, one of my students who applied for university in the US was not accepted by most of the university he applied for, except one. He mentioned he has epilepsy and has been suffering from the attacks sometimes. He thought the reason for the failure must have lied in the disease. Do you think that this kind of disease can be a disadvantage for the applicants?
So this is a nuanced question, right? This is nuanced. What I would say is if a student were to apply to Hamilton and reference throughout their application they had epilepsy, this would not be something that we would hold against them in our application review. This would be an example of something that we would want to ensure we had resources in place to support this student and their health and well-being in order to be successful on our campus environment. Now, with that said, a student having a disadvantage or advantage in the application process, each institution has a slightly different way of processing applications. And at the end of the day, the student's experience with epilepsy is part of that student's experience in life, right? So in order for the student to be successful, they'll need to ensure they have an institution that would be able to support them. So at Hamilton College, we would, for a student with epilepsy, we would note it in the application. We would not consider it as a negative or a positive attribute. It would simply indicate that when the student were to arrive on campus, we need to make sure that the student has access to adequate medical resources to ensure their health and well-being. So it's a nuanced question. And unfortunately, there's a lot of this application submission and support that is nuanced and really has to do with circumstances and the way specific schools are able to support them. But I would say that's the answer from Hamilton's perspective. Kaitlin, do you want to answer from the University of Vermont?
Yeah, I agree. It's neither an advantage nor a disadvantage to disclose that information at the point of application. We're going to be doing the same thing. We'll be referring the student to Student Accessibility Services, which is an office that we have in our campus that would create accommodations for the student to make sure that if the student chose to come to the University of Vermont, that the student would be successful. But an applicant would absolutely not be denied because of disclosure of having a disease like epilepsy. So that would absolutely not impact the student's application decision.
Thank you. Okay, two more questions. When a student is deferred, is it better to send additional recommendation letters?
Sure, I can touch on this one first. So there's two different definitions of deferred. I'm not sure which one that you're referring to, so I can speak to both. The first definition I think of when I hear the term deferred is if a student applies, for example, early action. So for University of Vermont, we have an early action deadline of November 1st. We decide that we're not going to make a decision on the student because we would like to evaluate them within the entire context of the application pool. So we wait until we receive the remainder of our applications for a second deadline of regular decision. So that means that we're not giving the student a decision right away, but we're deferring a little bit later so that we see them in the context of the whole pool. In that situation, it can be beneficial to send additional letters of recommendation. However, it's only beneficial if those recommendation letters provide new information. I would say, please don't send any recommendation letters that are just a repeat of information that we already have, of what's already in the application or what's already been written in another recommendation letter. But a new letter with additional information, we would welcome that pretty much for us anyway, at any point during the application process, if you feel that information is important enough to really have an impact on the decision. So that's one area. The other definition of deferring admission is when a student voluntarily says, and we've seen this a lot this fall, where a student is saying, I'm not ready to go to the United States for fall 2020 because of, for example, the COVID situation. I'm going to defer my admission until spring. That's the other definition of defer. In that instance, we wouldn't be expecting any additional information or any new letters of recommendation to come in because the student is already admitted. So I assume that your question refers to that first definition of if a student is deferred. So I would just say, as long as it is providing new information that we don't already have that you think is going to make an impact on our decision, or just provide some additional context that we don't already have, then yes, it's beneficial to send additional recommendation letters.
Thank you. Okay, Anna, do you have anything to say?
Yeah, I wanted to say also, new information can reflect, I know that the student is very passionate about University of Vermont or University of Hamilton, or University of Hamilton College. So if a student is deferred in an application process and you have additional context that you think would be helpful, or if you know that the student has said, I'm very interested in Hamilton College, I really want to go there even though I've been deferred, that type of information can be valuable. But usually, the person we would most want to hear advocating for themselves at that point would be the student. So I would always very strongly encourage a student, if they are in fact motivated by University of Vermont or Hamilton College, and they receive a deferral notification, realize that's not a denial, it's not a decision, it really means we're going to wait. So the student then is the best advocate for themselves, where they can reach out and say, this is something you may not have known about me, or this is information that shows that actually Hamilton College is my top choice. Something like that can be very helpful in a deferral process if it's genuine.
Thank you. Okay, the last question. Thank you for the great opportunity for us to learn about recommendations. I'm wondering if the best source of information to learn about each college or university is their website and the nearest American center if available. Well, the website, right?
Yeah, our websites are really great resources that will have just a wealth of information for you. And on our websites, you can also find our contact information. So please reach out to us and we can absolutely set up a time to have a separate conversation if you would like. If there's any additional information you would like to know about specific academic programs or just the general application process. So we're always happy to have those conversations, but that information will always be available on our website in great detail. And then of course, Education USA is going to be a phenomenal resource for all of you as well. But just going to put in another plug that we would love to hear from you. We would love to chat with you. So please don't ever hesitate to just send us an email and we can schedule a time to talk.
Right, so we had actually on our question and answer section, we'd actually included our email addresses. So maybe we can put those in the chat feature right now as well. So you can save those in case you would like to communicate with us directly. We're always eager to hear from counselors and teachers, particularly who have questions. And if we do hear the same question reflected multiple times from multiple people, we will usually update our website that next week to make sure that it is reflected. So when Kaitlin says that there's consistent information up there, we spend a long time trying to make sure that we're anticipating most commonly asked questions. But with that said, we can't anticipate everything. So if you have additional questions or concerns and want to have more information, you are very welcome to communicate with us directly.
Thank you. Regarding the service of Education USA centers in Japan, depending on the centers, because of the COVID-19, most of them are closed. And unfortunately, Education USA Tokyo has no more physical center. So I would suggest that you contact the university website directly. Thank you. So thank you everyone for the wonderful, questions. Anna, do you have anything to say?
Sorry, I just wanted to add that we know that there are limited resources in person right now, but it's hard to find benefits and silver linings to a global pandemic, isn't it? But one of the opportunities that has arisen is that most colleges and universities have really increased their virtual offerings. So this year, in a way that has never happened before, students and counselors can find information about universities and colleges virtually. So each of us will have additional virtual tours. Many of us have virtual information sessions, virtual interview opportunities for students that are available on a scale that has never before happened. So for instance, I know if you visit hamilton.edu/discover, you'll find a list of panels and information sessions, lots of virtual information that can be helpful for you and for your students. And I'm sure University of Vermont has a similar feature where you can find all of that information. So I would encourage you, it's a challenging time to be supporting students in their pursuit of education in the United States, but we are working very, very hard to make sure that despite these challenges, you have all the resources that we can provide you. And that's one of the few benefits that's come out of a global pandemic, is increased virtual opportunities and access for you and your students.
So Kaitlin, would you like to talk a little bit about your coming webinar of University of Vermont?
Well, we don't have any webinars that are scheduled yet, but I believe, Anna, you mentioned that you have a series of webinars taking place. While we don't have anything set yet, we are absolutely going to be running a series of webinars that's really designed for students that are located within East Asia. And we'll be sending out that information. All that information will be on our website, and any students and counselors that are within our network will be able to find information about those webinars as well. If you would like to get information about any webinars that we're putting on in the future, definitely feel free to send either one of us an email, and we can provide you with those opportunities and those times when we'll be running those. So at least for the University of Vermont, nothing set in stone yet, but it's definitely coming fall 2020. So more information to come on those.
Thank you very much. Well, we are kind of running out of time, but now I'd like to remind you one important thing, which is the copyright of the materials we use today. These belong to speakers who are from University of Vermont and Hamilton College. So please do not share or reuse them. It is strictly prohibited. Thank you very much for your understanding and cooperation. So before closing, I'd like to quickly share the current situation of the U.S. university and colleges affected by COVID-19. This is the special website which provides the links and the information related to COVID-19 and college admissions. So you can screenshot them and please use them. And also you can see the fall planning of U.S. universities and colleges as to which ones will reopen in person, hybrid, 100% online, and so on. You can see the most up-to-date situation from this Chronicle of U.S. Higher Education website. So please stay tuned. By the way, can you please talk a little bit about your plan of your institution from this fall, Kaitlin and Anna?
Sure. Yeah. So I can start about that. So we are going to be offering in-person classes this fall. So many of our students had moved onto campus a week ago because we are taking the safety measures very seriously. So we actually mailed out COVID tests to all of the students before they even arrived on campus, so that they would have to show a negative COVID test before they even arrived on campus. So many of our students arrived last Friday, and they're currently quarantining on campus before they'll move into their permanent housing and then be able to start taking in-person classes. We're really fortunate here in the state of Vermont that COVID-19 hasn't impacted us significantly, both within the city of Burlington, the whole state of Vermont, and then also on our campus as well. So we feel that we're really in a safe and secure location to be able to offer in-person course offerings to our students. So we're very excited about that. Many of our students also have the option of taking hybrid classes, so they can do a mix of both in-person and online. And then our students also have the option of just staying from home if that's what they feel is best for them and the safest situation for them, so that they can take their classes fully remote. So we have many of our students are returning. Most of our students are returning to campus. Many of our international students are returning to campus as well. So it's an exciting time. It's certainly a different time on campus. Our campus has never looked like this before, but we're feeling very confident that we'll be able to continue the high quality academic and research opportunities that we offer during any normal semester and moving forward. So that's what fall is going to look like for us.
And for us, we have a lot of similarities. So we are located, remember, about 4 hours from a major metropolitan city. The state of New York also was hit quite earlier on in the pandemic quite hard, but our local state government has been very, very responsive and very responsible in bringing those levels down. And at this point, New York State and Vermont, both of us are amongst the best states for lowest infection rates for COVID-19. At Hamilton, as the New York State has very specific quarantine requirements, about 2/3 of our students from domestically and internationally had to quarantine before coming to campus. We also, similar to Vermont, have required a negative COVID test before students move in. And throughout the semester, they're going to be taking classes in canopies, which is a fancy way of saying outdoor tents, where they'll be taking classes to allow air circulation as long as the weather is appropriate. They're also going to be having twice per week testing. We have COVID testing on campus, where students will be tested twice per week. Faculty and staff members will be tested either once or twice per week, depending on their proximity to students, to make sure that all of our population remains safe and secure at this time. So similar to University of Vermont, I think both of our institutions are quite well positioned within the United States to be able to offer in-person instruction in a safe capacity, ensuring the quality of education for all of our students and the safety of our local communities.
Thank you, Anna. Now, I'd like to remind you of the rest of the Yoga Week events, which are lined up for students and parents, but teachers are also welcome to attend these webinars, as many as you want. In addition, if you or your student would like to talk to EducationUSA advisors, please drop by our virtual office hours during the Yoga Week, which is between 1:30 and 4:30 p.m. every day. From next week, it's open on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So you can make, an individual appointment for online advising. Now it's almost the time to close the webinar, but before closing, I'd like to thank today's wonderful speakers, Kaitlin from University of Vermont, Anna from Hamilton College in New York, for their great presentation and participation. We learned so much about how to write good recommendation letters, and especially the importance of the context and learning difficulties. I think we share the same universal issues here. So I think we really, really learned so much. And thank you very much. And Anna and Kaitlin, so lastly, would you please give teachers and counselors in Japan any final words?
I would say thank you. Thank you for the work that you do to support your students in traditional times. We know these are not traditional times. We're here to try and work with you and support you, but we appreciate and recognize the hard work that goes into supporting your students right now through this challenging process and these challenging times. So I would say thank you. And if you think of ways that we can support you, please reach out and let us know.
Absolutely, exactly what I would say. Just thank you so much. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for waking up early to listen to our presentation today and sticking with us through the end. We really appreciate it. And thank you for all of the work that you do, and know that we will continue to be resources for you. You have our contact information. So again, please don't hesitate to reach out if there's anything that we can assist with.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you really so much, Anna and Kaitlin, for speaking at the webinar from the US. We truly appreciate your huge contribution. So everyone, please join me in giving them a big hand in your heart. Pach, 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 pach. ありがとうございました. Thank you so much. Okay, we will stop recording now. So, as I promised in the beginning,